Uganda has withdrawn from the International Coffee Organization agreement, the government citing what it calls unfair tariffs and other barriers that restrict the exports of processed coffee to Europe and elsewhere. Africa's largest coffee producer, behind Ethiopia, had not previously given reasons for pulling out of a two-year extension to the ICO's 2007 agreement. This means that the country is effectively withdrawing from the preeminent intergovernmental body tasked with overseeing global coffee production and trade and fostering cooperation between producers and consuming nations. Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni has long complained about what he says are lopsided trade rules that rob the likes of Uganda of value in key commodities such as coffee. Well, to expand a little bit more on this often lopsided trade agreements that Africa continuously finds itself tangled in, we're now joined by Zambian economist Yusuf Dadio. Thanks so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, good to talk to you again. Uganda withdrawing from this international coffee agreement, does this come as a surprise, or is this something that you've seen generally, not just with coffee but other kinds of agreements where our commodities and our products perhaps suffer some kind of discrimination or restriction?
Absolutely. This is something that we've been talking about for the last 20 years. From the time the African Growth and Opportunity Act was launched, that was probably around 1999, 2000. So it's a good 20 years ago. The debate on the trade agreements with the European Union, with North America, with the West, have always had a side, or rather it was always loaded in favor of the Western countries against developing economies. And this came out in many dialogues around aid for trade and why aid for trade was not working, because clearly the West was interested in accessing the resources of Africa without the Africans being able to reciprocate and access the resources of the West. And a typical one is that there was open trade in the European Union, everything but arms, and then there was a Cotonou agreement. And in these agreements, you'd find that the West was interested in open bilateral trade, but restrictive movement of Africans into Western countries. Whereas Western countries could come into Africa and just pay for a visa or buy a visa on entry. The other way was not reciprocal, where you have to apply 3 months in advance and there's no guarantee that you will get a visa. So for many of us as Africans, we would argue that, okay, you want to have access to our resources, you want to build factories and supply African economies with your services and products. Well, open the doors for Africans to work in Europe and Africans to work in the West, to reciprocate. And this never happened, and it continues to be a challenge even today. So we've seen this been going on over the last 20 or 30 years, and quite clearly Uganda has decided to put its foot down and try to change the nature of the relationship.
All right, let's talk about some specific examples, because they are arguing that all that Europe and other parts of the world are interested in are the raw beans, and that they don't want Uganda beneficiating their products, creating products with their coffee and selling those into Europe. They just want the beans to arrive in Europe, and then in Europe they can then take these beans and cook them, brew them, package them, and then they go up in value in the food chain, and they probably selling it 3-4 times more out there, and they don't want Uganda to be part of that.
Well, this is absolutely correct. And we see this in the example you've given. We see this in the tea processing coming through Kenya, where Kenya is the largest trader of tea on the African continent, but it goes out as raw tea. For Zambia in particular, where I come from and where I'm based, we've been exporting copper for the last 100 years or more in its raw form. And it was only the founding fathers of this nation that had fought for one copper processing plant in Zambia, and that was built in the 1970s. And we've not seen any follow-up on the development of copper processing in Zambia, because it's in the West's interest for Zambian copper to go out of Zambia, which today fetches about $10,000 a ton. But when we see the copper wire coming back from Europe, or copper products coming back from Europe, they're 100 times in value compared to the raw copper that we've been exporting. And this is the same for copper, for manganese, for cobalt. Literally any product that we produce in Zambia goes out as raw material. And in our relationship with the West, the whole aid for trade agenda was to be able to help African countries to build capacity, to add value to the primary products that come out of our countries, so that what we could export would be processed products which would fetch better prices on the international market. But this has been lip service over the last 30 or 40 years. We've not seen any of this happen, not with support. Countries that have managed to do it are countries that have taken their hands and put into their own pockets and decided to do it domestically at home.
So why do we put up with it? I mean, if Ghana and Ivory Coast said, listen, we're not going to give you our cocoa, the European chocolate industry would collapse.
Absolutely, absolutely. But the situation we find ourselves in is that we're put in a catch-22 situation. And I think we need to see what is happening in Uganda as a turning point. That there's come a time now where African countries can put their foot down and say, we're not going to go through with this, what we've been doing over the last 3 or 4 decades. We're going to insist that we are able to improve on the production within our own countries, on the value addition. And unfortunately, for countries that rely on Western support, if you look at most of the African countries, between 25 and 40% of our national budgets are funded by what they call foreign financing and grants. To a large extent, what that means is that your foreign support partner, which could be the European Union, it could be an individual country, it could be countries from North America, they will only provide you with budget support, in other words, bring money into your country to help you run your country, if you comply with their conditions. And in Zambia, we've seen this. We've tried to change the value-added tax system in Zambia and replace it with a goods and services tax, which is a final tax, which is not claimable, because the mining companies in Zambia have a right to claim their value-added tax. And we failed to implement this because of pressure coming from the mining companies. We've tried to introduce higher and additional taxes in the mining industry, and this has not happened over the last 10 years. Again, because the mining companies will put pressure on our economy and ensure that they control the exchange rate for the Zambian kwacha against the US dollar, so that should we put any pressure on the big multinational investors, they hit back by squeezing the economy.
All right, so, I mean, is this going to come at a price for Uganda, for example? I mean, they're the second largest producer of coffee on the continent, which means this is a significant export for them. What could be the consequence of them pulling out of this agreement?
Well, I think the first thing is that they're likely to see their currency beginning to devalue, and devalue quite rapidly, because the world currencies are no longer determined by how much gold reserves you have, which was what the benchmark was maybe 40, 50 years ago. World currencies now are just determined by the superpowers, the nations that control world economies, which of course are very, very close to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions. So quite clearly, you would begin to see that the local currency in Uganda would start to devalue, making the cost of living in Uganda unbearable. And what you begin to see is civil unrest, and the civil unrest results in government having to pull back on some of these decisions that are in the best interest of the people, but not necessarily in the best interest of the outside world. And this begins to weaken the relationship between the government of the day and the citizens of that particular country, in this case, Uganda. So the pressure comes externally, and eventually the government will succumb unless they're brave enough to fight it all the way.
Yusuf, always a pleasure talking to you. Insights greatly appreciated. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Take care. Sikomo Kwambiri.
Sikomo.
Thank you. All right, that's Yusuf Dadio, who's an economist in Zambia, helping to explain some of the issues in terms of African countries producing raw materials, but finding that the trade rules are challenging in countries such as Europe, and that's why Uganda's pulled out of the International Coffee Agreement. But as Yusuf has warned, there could be consequences.